programming, a lot of different stuff. And later, in the end of the day, we're actually going to have our first guest lecture of this week, which is by Facebook, and people who are working on GraphQL in the Boston office. So stick around. Later in the week, we'll have most of our guest lectures, and I would say they're a pretty good opportunity to get to know what is it like to work in the industry if you don't know already. And I don't know, mingle and get a job. I've heard that happens. Alright, so the first lecture is about CSS. My name is Slava. It's my third year doing 6148 in some form or shape. So I want to preface that although it's called an advanced CSS lecture, the topics we're going to walk through are actually foundational basics of CSS. And they can go really deep. And the motivation will be presented, I guess. So we'll see. So CSS is pretty simple, right? Probably you learned CSS last week or maybe before. And usually the way people present it is like, oh, you write this one rule and your text is different. Maybe your text is red now, or it's bigger, or the box is slightly bigger. But there's a lot more to CSS than just changing the size of boxes and changing colors. So let's look at CSS in 1994. That's when CSS was created. Most of you were not even born yet. I was almost born. So HTML was mostly used to publish academic papers from universities. And CSS was just created in 1994 just to make colors bigger. Or sorry, text bigger, colors different. And in 1996, they actually introduced GIFs. You know, how can the internet exist without GIFs, right? But that happened even later. So here you see an iconic example called the dancing baby, which is a GIF on the right side, which was used on almost every website in 1996 to 2001 or something like that. So I wouldn't know, but some history here. Anyway, today web is a lot more complicated. Here we have a screenshot of Pinterest. Maybe? And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on. It's a huge big screen with a lot of columns, complicated layout, a lot of pictures, beautiful text, all of that. Another example is TweetDeck. TweetDeck is a web app that helps you to manage your Twitter feeds. If you are a pro user, you might want to use 5 columns with different graphs and analytics inside. Also a really complicated app. CSS has to deal with stuff like pseudo 3D. I guess the best way to describe it is like this menu that looks like it's hovering on top of the page, but you know it's not an actual 3D. So CSS does a lot of these things. It does like composition of a lot of things, complicated layouts, 3D, and even animation. So here I have an example of my animations that I want to show you what's possible. So you might have a beautiful animation on your website like this, right? Like it does some fancy stuff. So that's pretty complicated. Like CSS wasn't designed to do this originally. And web evolved over time to support things like this. So that's my point. Okay. And another big feature that probably most of you would understand like immediately is responsive web design. You want your layout to work really well independent on the size of the screen. I don't know about you guys, but whenever, like you know this period after finals when you want to obsessively check your grades, when you do it on your phone every morning from student.mit.edu and your finger just presses on 5 links at once, that's not great, right? And in this moment you wish that maybe MIT invested a little bit more in responsive design for the web applications. Maybe one day. So CSS can be really frustrating for a lot of people. And I found these GIFs online, and this is what you find when you Google GIF describing CSS program. So the one on the left kind of represents this state when you have your CSS and you want to fix one small thing, and you fix it, and then something else breaks. And then you fix that, and the first thing breaks, and you don't understand why. And that happens quite a lot. Like with experience, the more you use it, the more you'll see it. And I still don't understand sometimes why my stuff breaks. And no matter how much I try to understand. And the second GIF is very similar too. It's like you think that when you do this one thing, it will give you the same result everywhere, but actually can do completely different things, depending on the context. So this is the general feeling towards CSS. And the reason we want to learn fundamentals and basics is so when this situation happens, you can actually understand how it works so you can debug it yourself, instead of just Googling and copy-pasting. So these are the today topics we're going to cover. It's not a comprehensive list of everything CSS has to offer, but to fit it in one lecture, in 1 hour, I thought these 4 topics are probably the most useful and the most helpful for you to understand in order to debug your CSS and make it pretty. So box model and layouts are like big ones that you need to understand to be using CSS effectively. And animations and responsive layouts is more like a result that you want to achieve in the end of the class to make your website look good. Alright, so we will start with box model. Alright, so box model is a formal name of the system that CSS presents to you. Remember last week Rupayan said that web can be viewed as a collection of boxes with text in it. So he's not wrong. It's literally called box model, and I'll explain why. So let's say we have this simple HTML and CSS. So take a little bit of time to look at it. So the HTML is just literally one box. It says hello world. And the CSS is also pretty simple. It has some margin, it has some padding, it has a border, it has a background, and it has a width of 250 pixels. So it should be pretty simple, just one box. And this is what it looks like. Pretty simple. Also, in this lecture, on every slide with an example, I'll try to put a link, just like on the bottom. So if you look at the slides later, you can actually open the link, and there will be like a live version where you can like try it out. And sometimes we'll be using these links. So again, back to the example, you have this one box, hello world. And you can see that the text actually has space around it. So the border of the box is not right at the text. This is what we call padding. And also the box also has some space around it, so it doesn't touch the edges of the screen. This is what we call margin. And here's an illustration. If you use Chrome DevTools, this is what you will see. If you color some element, it will show you like these color-coded sections. The orange one represents margin, the green one represents padding, and the blue one is the text, and the border is just border. So yeah, there's another link on the bottom in case you want to look at the more detailed explanation later, but this is a general idea. Every box has these 4 properties. The border, the padding, the margin, and the text itself. So each box is actually 4 boxes. Yeah, so remember I gave it a width of 250 pixels. So it turns out 250 pixels is only the width of the text area. But if you calculate the padding and calculate the border, it's actually 284. So a little bit bigger than what we told it to be. And this confuses a lot of people because people expect the box to be 250, but then when you actually add all the padding and borders, it actually becomes 284, and now it doesn't fit in where it needs to be fitted. And yeah, you don't understand why, and this is why, and I'll show you more examples. So, decided to put a meme. I don't know if I did it well, but example on the right is actually a box of the width 300, and inside of it, it has 2 other boxes of the width 150. So you would think 150 plus 150 equals 300, so it should fit on one line, but it doesn't. And yeah, it's almost the same as 1 plus 1. So here's the same example, bigger. Again, there's a link on the bottom if you want to look at it later. So yeah, the big box called my div is 300 pixels, inside you have two boxes of width 150, and they don't fit together. And why? What do I say? Yeah, it's almost 84. It's actually like 152 because there's 1 pixel of padding and like makes it 1 pixel bigger left and 1 pixel bigger right. So yeah, you're right. It's bigger because of padding. And in this case, there are multiple ways to solve it, right? So what are some ways to solve it? Again, I want them to be 150 pixels so they can fit together. But they're more. Yeah, sure.
Oh, you make the width 148 pixels?
Yeah, you can make the width smaller, calculating the size of padding, so it actually becomes 150 in total. You're right. Another way would be remove the padding, right? Like if you remove the padding, there's nothing extra, so it's 150 pixels. I don't know how many of you are following, but the basic idea is this. Remove the padding, the box becomes smaller. That's what we want. Or make the width different, or use this thing called box sizing property. And box sizing property is not very well known, but turning it into a border box from content box default, you can tell it that the width actually should accommodate for padding and border and not just the text. So this way you can tell this box is always 150 pixels no matter how much padding I have. And if you change the padding amount, you don't need to change the width. So this is a really useful property that if you don't know it, you will need to do a lot of calculation yourself. But using this property, you can just let the browser do it for you. Alright, so that was box model, and I think this is what's important about box model. Usually people struggle with like sizes. We'll move to the next topic called layouts. So if you didn't follow box model, you can follow now. This is actually pretty fun. So layouts are really complicated in CSS. There are a lot of different things you can use. And I really like this website called learnlayout.com. That's where I learned it. And there are a lot of examples, a lot of interactive things that you can look at. And whenever I build my website, I always forget how to use the layouts, so I look it up there. So it's a great website. I'm going to cover the basics of it. But if you want to learn more, you can go to that website. It's really good. And I have another slide where it's bigger to emphasize the point. It's really good. And I have another one. Alright, so here's the basics. You have the display property on each element. So each element can be one of two things. It can be either a block, or it can be inline. So when it is a block, it's a separate line. It tries to get as big as possible. It tries to occupy as much space as it can. And usually, most things are blocks, like divs. They're actually separate boxes. And this is example number one, the green box. And there is another element type, display type, called inline. This is a small box on the second paragraph, in the second paragraph. This is usually for things like text decoration, or links, or what else could be there? Footnote. Basically, a lot of text-related stuff. So inline elements stay within the text. They might make the line a little taller, but they never occupy a separate line. They try to be like in line with the text and other inline elements. So now you can imagine that if you want something to be stacked on top of each other, you want to use a lot of blocks. But if you want everything to be close to each other on the same line, you can use inline. But that's not it. There are actually a lot of other things display can do. But they're all similar. They're all kind of related to either a box, block, either a block or inline. So there's a block, there's an inline, this inline block, which is boss of like best of both worlds, I guess. Like it stays within the line, but also can do anything else a block can do. There's none. You can say display none. This will remove the thing from the page. So you might ask me, why would you ever remove something that you just coded? And the answer is maybe you have a pop-up, and the pop-up is hidden, so it's display none. And when you click a button, you change the display property to block, and then it appears. right? So you can hide things and then you show them. And there are other things like flex and grid, and this is more special, and I'm not going to talk about it right now. So positioning is another big thing of layouts in CSS. And you can position blocks normally, called statically, so it will just be like block, 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 block. But if you want the block to be somewhere special, you can use this position property and change it. So here's an example. I have one special block on the bottom right in the example. It's blue. And it's fixed. So no matter where I am on the page, it will always be in the corner on the bottom right. So imagine you go to a website and you have an advertisement. You know, one of those pop-up advertisements that just follows you wherever you go? That's how you do it. And you can do useful stuff. You can have notifications there. Or let's say you have a messenger app and you want like a notification in the corner, and no matter where you are on the page, you always see it. So that's pretty useful. And the next one is relative. So imagine the box is in some place, right? You don't know where it is. It's like browser decides where it is. But you want to tell it, hey, how about you move this box 20 pixels up from where it's supposed to be? So this is what relative does. Relative says, move it relative to the position it is originally in. And you might ask me, why would you ever want to do this? So have you ever seen Harlem Shake memes when you press a button and everything shakes on the page in place? Maybe not. I don't know. It's an old meme. But you can do it with this property. You can shift it a little bit around its original position. And this can make the effect of shaking. Well, yeah, sounds really useful, I know. All right, next one. Absolute positioning. This one is actually useful, especially for games and like special elements that you might want to put somewhere relative to the top of the page. So it's very different from fixed. So fixed was relative to the screen. So no matter where you go, it's always in the same place relative to the screen. Absolute is position something somewhere relative to another element, usually the whole page. So if you want something to be on the very top of the page, like a top button, you can use it. You can do it using absolute. So a lot of this elements positioning is actually really important once you start building your layouts, but right now it might seem like there's just a bunch of things you can do. Alright, and the last thing I want to cover in layouts are floats. And floats are actually terrible. They break your layout page. And originally people created them so your picture can be within the text. Just like in this example. So I would tell you that try to never use floats unless you're trying to put a picture within the text. Every other application that you could Google usually just breaks a lot of things. And you don't even need it these days. There are a lot of other good things you can use. But yeah, an important thing to know is like once you use float, a lot of things will start floating, not just this one element, but everything after it. And you need a float clear fix. And this is why you shouldn't use it, because it just requires you to do a lot of hacks. Basically, the only thing to remember about floats is not to use them. Alright, next. Here's a common task. A lot of people always Google that. It's like one of the most upvoted questions on Stack Overflow. You have a div, and the div is inside of another div. How do you center the div? How do you make sure it's in the middle? And there are several versions of this question. One question is, how do you center it horizontally? And here's the answer. You need to make sure that the box inside has a size. And also you need to make sure that you give the margin to the box outer. Outer? I'm not a native English speaker. So automatic, on the left and on the right. So by saying it should be automatic, the browser will make it equal and it will be aligned and in the middle. But another question is, how do you make it aligned vertically? How do you make it centered vertically? And that's like a question of this generation of web developers. Nobody can ever figure it out, and it might be difficult depending on the context. So I'm not presenting a solution here. You can Google it. Flexbox. So this is actually a really cool thing. This is like much bigger than everything else I showed you. Everything else I showed you was like basics, something that existed in CSS since 90s. Flexbox is new. So Flexbox is a new standard that was developed in CSS, I think around 2010. And finally, it's widely available in all browsers. And it's the best thing that ever happened to browsers. Literally because it solves every CSS problem in layouting people ever had. Well, maybe not every, but it does everything people wanted to do at the time it was designed. Here's my example. I'll make it bigger. I have 3 different examples here. In each one, I have a container black box, and I have multiple boxes inside, they're blue. And all of them use the same CSS. And what Flexbox does, I can tell Flexbox, hey, I have multiple things in my Flexbox, in my container. Please make them the same size, no matter how big the container is, or no matter how many elements I have. So all of these are using the same CSS, but I have different number of things in each box. So in the first box I have only 3 things. In the second box I have 6. In the last one I have even more. I don't know how to count more than 6. So no matter how many elements I have, each box has the same size as its neighbor. So this is what Flexbox does. You might not know how many elements you will have. Like maybe you have a list of comments. But you will know that all of them will look okay. All of them will look the same size. And here's another example. Now instead of adding more boxes, I'll change the size of my container. And I'll tell it to scale it differently. I'll say the first box should only increase with a scale factor of 1. The second box should be increasing twice as much. And the last box doesn't increase at all. It stays the same. So here's the example bigger. You can see that the first box called get bigger gets bigger. It actually gets bigger in every new box because it gets, like the container gets bigger. The second box is called gets even bigger, and it's actually growing twice as fast, twice as much. It's always twice as big as the first box. And the last box always stays the same size. So it might look simple to you, but it's actually really complicated to do without Flexbox, and this is why Flexbox is the best. So I showed you a bunch of boxes, but to give you a better sense what it does, I will open this website called Fixed by Flexbox. And it has pretty good examples. So here, I'll show you the grid system. So this is like a usual grid that you might have used in Bootstrap. So in Bootstrap, you usually are limited to 12 columns. Or your columns are like some factor of 12, or like 1/12. So maybe like 1/2 and 1/2, 1/2, 1/3, 1/3. In the Flexbox, you can have columns of any size, and you can have them as many as you want, and they always will be actually scaled well, and it's not even that complicated to code. You can just add one property. And in Bootstrap grid, there are a lot of hard-coded values to do it well. So this is what you can do with Flexbox. Another thing is called Holy Grail layout. That's the name of a layout. They don't have a picture here. Great. Oh, all right. They have this. No. Oh, this picture. So the Holy Grail layout is when you have a header, you have a footer, and then you have 2 columns, and then you have 1 column for your advertisement because you're greedy. So this is actually really easy to do with Flexbox. Here you need just 2 Flexboxes. One Flexbox that has header, the middle part, and then the footer, so it's like a stack of 3 things. And you can say that the middle part is always the biggest, and the 2 sides, like header and footer, always stay the same size. This is how you can make sure that footer is always on the bottom, header is always on the top. And then you have another Flexbox in the middle that now is horizontal. You have 3 columns. And you can say that the menu is always the same, the content is always most of the page, and then the advertisement space is always on the right, the left of it. So Flexbox is really useful. Try to learn more about it. I guarantee you, if you find a job and you do web dev, and you do something new, like you build a new website, people will probably use Flexbox. And Flexbox can do a lot more, and there are a lot of different options you can turn on and turn off. So I recommend this website called A Guide to Flexbox on CSSTricks.com. It sounds sketch, but it's actually really good. That's what you use to look up all the properties when you're using it. Yeah, and the slides will be available later. And yeah, this website I just showed you called Solved by Flexbox, where you can see really good examples how people use Flexbox to do something really good. Alright, next topic, animations. They're nice. They make your website look nice. They also make your interactions seem clear. So for example, if you have a pop-up window and it just appears out of nowhere, it can be confusing. But if you have a small animation that makes it appear from the bottom, you kind of understand what it refers to, or like where it came from. So usually when you will be using animations, you'll be using libraries. So here I have a list of pretty good libraries I used before. And libraries are very easy to use, but sometimes they break because they have conflicts. And to understand why they break, you need to understand the basics. And this is why I'm going to go through basics. So here's my example. Just look at the GIF. Yeah, really exciting. Anyway, so what happens here, I click a button, add new comment, and it adds a new div, new comment. And initially it's like semi-transparent, and with animation it gets more solid. Can everyone see it? I don't know if that's really visible. But that's the point, right? Like the point is that it appears. And I'll show you how to do this. So here's my HTML on the left and my CSS on the right. HTML says I have a container where I'll put all my comments, and I have a button that I click to edit. So you can notice that the comment has the class appeared. And the class is important. Alright, now let's look at CSS on the right. So now, for everything, I have opacity set to 0.4. So opacity is the opposite of transparency. Yeah, so opacity is the opposite of transparency. It means that if opacity is low, it means transparency is high. So everything by default is semi-transparent. But if I add this class, appeared, I set the transparency to 1, so opacity to 1, transparency to 0, so it will be fully visible. So this is what it is like by default, and then I add this class, and it will actually be opaque, not transparent. I'm sorry. And an important thing here is transition property. So notice what happens here. I have transition, and I tell it I'm working with opacity, and I give it 3 seconds. And 3 seconds is to tell it how long the animation is. Basically, what I'm doing here, I have the state, the default state, and then what it should be in the end, and this is a description of animation. And here I have my JavaScript, and this JavaScript is actually important to understand too. It's very similar to your catbook JavaScript where you add a new comment. So you create a new DOM element, put the text, and then put it into the DOM, into your container. So it's the same as you did the first week. But I also have this special thing in the end. I change the class name to appeared later. And changing this class name is what will trigger the animation. So before you change the state from before to after, the browser will not play any animations. But there's more. There's this line called get bounding client rectangle. I don't know what that means, but I know what it does. So here's the story. The browsers are really optimized. So when the browser sees that you added a lot of stuff to your page, it's not going to render it immediately. It's going to wait and say like, okay, I'll give you 250 milliseconds. Add all your stuff, when you're done, I'll render all of it at once. It's called batch processing. And that's a concept that probably a lot of you have seen in other classes. So the browser batches updates. But when it batches updates of adding an element and then changing the class, the animation will not run. So what you want to do, you want to add the element, force the browser to render it, and then change the class name so the animation actually runs. So getBounding client rectangle actually is what forces the browser to render it. Otherwise, it will never even understand the difference without the class and after the class. So your animation will not run. So here's a more complicated example just to demonstrate the point that you can do whatever you want. You can change position, rotation, color, everything. And the general idea of animation is that you have the beginning state, you have the final result, and in the beginning, you have transitions. And you might want to tell browser to just figure out the transition. If my initial color is red and the final color is blue, just figure out how to transition from red to blue. And usually the browser will do some linear transition. But you can also specify the exact transition yourself. You can say my beginning state is red, my final state is blue, but in between it becomes white, or black, or green, or whatever you want it to be. So you can do anything. And here's an example of this curve, of this box rotating. I have beginning state on the left, I have the end state on the right. I have this like animated properties here. And I have the animation description in two parts, here and here. So this description is describing how to transition and what properties to transition when I'm going to initial state to final state. And this section on the left describes how to go backwards from final to initial. So if I really wanted to, I could have had two different animations going backwards and forward. And there's this thing called keyframes, which is what I described. You can say, you can specify the intermediate state of any animation. You can say that in the beginning it's on 0, 0, and then at 30% it goes to 0, 50, or 50, 0. And then later it gets to 50, and 100 is like 100, 100. So basically what browser will do, it will plot the points, and then it will try to fit a curve to make the animation as smooth as possible to fit into your constraints. So that's pretty cool. It's actually non-trivial to do yourself, and the browsers do it really fast. And the animations became so expensive that browsers actually implemented GPU support. So your video card is actually processing all these animations. Animations can be really complicated, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. So here's an example of CSS-only animation, no JavaScript, no anything, just to demonstrate the point that you can do anything. Here are some resources you can look at later, and we'll move to the